our small fairs, but we also have a Maker Faire in New York, which is in the fall, Maker Faire Rome, which is probably the third largest event, and but most major cities have some version of a Maker Faire going on. Do you want to say a few words?
Sure. So maybe just give a little bit of an overview of Maker Faire and how it fits into the broader company, which might be helpful as background. So Maker Faire, the company started with Make Magazine. So we have a media group. The magazine has grown, and we've now published over 80 technical book titles and have several online properties, the biggest of which is makescene.com, where we talk about all things related to the maker movement. We also have obviously the events group. The events group is primarily Maker Faire, and as Dale mentioned, we do over 130 Maker Fairs around the world. Everything from this is the largest event, or second largest is New York. Rome is the third, and it goes all the way down to community organized events which we call mini Maker Fairs. One of the new things, and I guess we'll talk about a couple of the new initiatives that we have, is the School Maker Faire program. So there's been a growing interest in communities and schools to host their own Maker Fairs, and so we just want to make that easy to do. So we'll talk more about it in a little bit, but it goes all the way from school fairs all the way up to this spectacle that you see here. So that's our events group. We also have an event called MakerCon, which is about the business of making. And then the last part of our business is our commerce business. So you can see a lot of what we sell out here at Maker Shed, but it's really about providing the tools and the kits and the things that makers like to use. So it ranges from, it includes 3D printers and drones and tools and supplies, all things related to making. So that's a little bit of an overview of Maker Media as a company.
Okay. I started Maker Faire, really had this idea of having, through the magazine, met really interesting people who were makers, that I wanted to create an opportunity for people to talk to makers and meet them and see what they did. And it's not that different than a craft fair or an art fair, science fair. You bring something and you stand around it and you talk about it. Obviously, some of the things that come to Maker Faire are quite large. They don't fit on a table, but that was the essential idea, is to build that kind of event around people interacting with makers. And so for the most part, people aren't sitting, or it's not a conference or a convention. They're moving around, browsing, interacting with people, and interacting even with each other. And I think one of the motivations, not only for growing this event, but also the network events, is really almost popularizing the maker movement, making it something that is accessible, approachable to everybody, not just like a geek group or a certain segment of our culture, but to look at maker culture as something that is fairly broad, and that making is something that lots of people do and takes lots of different forms. It isn't just electronics or robots, but you see those things here at Maker Faire. You see 3D printing and you see drones, but you'll also see fire sculpture. You'll also see, art cars. You'll see textiles. So what I love is that we've managed to create an event in which all those things belong together, and it also, I think, helps to create an environment for people where they're stimulated by seeing connections between very different things. So let me just open up to questions and see what's on your mind and what you're thinking about. Yes?
Actually, I have two, but let me ask my first one right now before I give everyone else a chance. If you could close your eyes and just think of one thing, what would be your favorite moment in the Maker Faire? Anything at all?
Well, I'd say it's
that comes to your mind.
the expression of a child's face.
There you go.
When I see them really smiling and like almost pulling away to go see something, what's over there? Let's go over there. That's what I think of.
And for you?
There's a gentleman over in the Learn to Solder tent who told a story about how he actually learned to solder at a Maker Faire a number of years ago, and he now works at don't remember if it's Intel or Google, but he's come back and now he's teaching soldering to the next generation of kids. I think that's really cool.
Thank you.
Okay, best technology this year you've seen?
I don't know. I mean, I don't really have that kind of filter in my head, and some of it is not a technology show like CES. These are more like applications, and I kind of think like, what made me laugh, or what caught my attention. And when I think of something like in Fiesta, the dark room, there's a young woman in there with an exhibit called Light Play, and it's all those. They kind of go like this. All these, they look. I don't know how to describe them. They're like three-pronged things with eyes on them that are color lights. And she told me she came several years ago. I know. I'd rather be out there too. Oh, it's fine. I'm glad to have him here.
The only
It keeps us
honest one
humble.
in the room.
Exactly. But she came from Las Vegas. She came here a couple of years ago as a graphic artist, and just loved what she saw, and said, "I want to learn how to do these things." And she began learning about Arduino. And I was talking to her the other night. She calls herself now a hardware designer, not just a designer, a hardware designer. And she had the idea for what she built in a dream. And last year she bought one of those little pods to Maker Faire and exhibit it. And this year she has a whole display of it, and we have it in the center of that hall. And I just watch people go up and interact with that. And and here's the point. She said to me, most of the technology in our life, there's like a veil around it, and we don't know what's behind it. And when you see her sculpture, you can say, well, how does that work? Does that have a motor? Yeah, it has a motor. How do you make those greens? Oh, I 3D printed that. And each set or each pod has a controller behind it, and it's networked behind it. And you can have that conversation and begin taking apart. So that's what's new in technology, in a sense, is how these things are put together, and that are transparent to people, and they can talk about them rather than say, here's my phone, it's just all packaged and boxed up and I don't know what that is.
I think we've seen a number of really interesting things come out of the broader maker movement. I mean, more recently, 3D printing is something that's become very common. Drones is another thing. When you look what's coming now, one of the things that I think is really fun to watch, because my daughter's interested in it, is wearable computing. So I think a lot of what we do kind of attracts a male audience, but I don't think I think making is broader than that, and I think so that's one new area that I think is very exciting. We did a wearable fashion show just at 2 o'clock. I think it's happening again later this afternoon. It's definitely worth checking out.
I think 5 o'clock was the light fashion show.
Yeah.
The light fashion show, yeah.
Yes, sir.
The maker community has been growing steadily in the last couple of years. Some products, like drones, have touched the mainstream, but the maker movement itself hasn't become mainstream. Can you elaborate a bit on why that hasn't happened yet? And do you expect it that, because there was this vision that someday everybody's going to be a maker and we're going to have 3D printers at home and do everything. So can you elaborate a bit why that hasn't happened?
Well, I think it's arguable what you say. So it depends on what you think. You're from Germany, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think for instance, some places it's much further. I think Germany actually is kind of behind in this. But it was actually early on. Germany was the hardware hacking was in Berlin and other places was really kind of very inspirational. Some of the early work that I saw. Blinken Lights was a building that had they were controlling all the window lights in it, and they were able to send messages and do things through that. But I think it actually has it's a mixed thing. I don't want to be homogeneously mainstream. I actually want to be impacting mainstream culture, though. And I think making is, I think it has grown and grown over these 10 years and continues to, just the fact we had a White House Maker Faire last year. We're doing a National Maker Faire in June. We're seeing lots of people paying close attention to it. So I'd kind of say that it, for my purposes, it's, this it's certainly more mainstream than I could have expected, and I expect it to continue to grow. That's where I see in education, innovation, and culture. I think it's really in the conversation, and it's actually hanging in. It's not like just some trend that's kind of come in and out. It's, this is a long, sustained growth that I think is having really good impact. So I don't know. Does that answer your question? Or, it's hard to say what those things are when but I think some ways my framing around Maker Faire is I want people to see themselves as producers, not just consumers. I'm not necessarily trying to eliminate consumer culture, but in some ways just create a new identity around who we are and what we're doing. And I think by a lot of measures, we're impacting a lot more people than you almost have a right to imagine we could.
Sure. Follow up, to become producers, what do you think has to happen on a global scale? Is it in the education system? Is it that the hardware has to become more accessible? The tools,
Well, it already is, but I don't think it's a measure like, as you mentioned earlier, like everybody will have a 3D printer. It may or may not be the case that 3D printing is in every home. But people understanding 3D printing, being able to interact with it, we have companies like Shapeways here where you can create something at home and send it off to a service, and maybe you don't need a 3D printer. You could go to a makerspace, they have a 3D printer. So there are different ways this gets deployed. One of the coolest companies I like is 3D Hubs, in which it's trying to network 3D printers that exist in your neighborhood, and so that maybe you could get something printed by someone on your street. And so I think technologically, all those forces are pretty well aligned to make things cheaper and more accessible. And I think, kind of coupled with Maker Faire and other things, making it more popular so people know about these things and can choose to do them.